Okay, ladies and gentlemen, before we get this rockstar panel started, I'm Ray Cross with FC International. I just have a few housekeeping comments I'd like to make. Number one, first and foremost, we'd like to thank CIO as this breakout session sponsor. Thank you very much to CIO. Questions from the audience will be done with 3x5 index cards. There'll be staff representatives from AFCEA and INSA to collect your cards and get them up to me, and then I'll deliver them to the stage. Yeah, please don't wait until the very end to write down your questions. What happens is then there's a huge deluge at the end, and we can't get through all the questions. Send them up early, and yeah, that would be greatly appreciated. The ones that are written legibly get priority. This session is not eligible for continuing education credits. Wanted to remind everybody that media may be present during this breakout session, and please join us for the keynote luncheon immediately following. So when this ends, please go directly to the main ballroom where we heard Director Abizaid for lunch. So thank you very much, and without further ado, General Lawrence, over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Ray. And I never get a chance to correct Ray. He's always correcting me, but the luncheon speaker is with the Undersecretary of Defense, Ms. Hicks. Right.
Oh, I thought I said, never mind.
All right. Well, welcome very much to our first breakout session that we've got scheduled. We appreciate you being here. It's great to see so many familiar faces. And this is an exciting topic for me, and it really is an honor to moderate this distinguished panel as I introduce to you who we have. And I just feel that we have the best leaders in place as we move forward to get the right support to our men and women in service of our nation. And so I really appreciate what we're doing. And a lot has changed since I obviously was the CIO G6. And I'm an advocate of John Cotter, who wrote Leading Change and done a number of sessions on his book and his 8 steps to leading change as we go forward. And we'll kind of interweave some of that in here as we go forward. But over a decade ago, he said, the rate of change is not going to slow down anytime soon. If anything, competition in most industries and the government will probably speed up even more in the next few decades, and that's borne out. That is for sure as it's gone forward. So I'm excited about our panel today, Leading Change, a look at the CIO, CDO, and CDAO roles. So it is my privilege to introduce our first panelist, Ms. Lori C. Wade. She's the Intelligence Community Chief Data Officer and dual-hatted as the Assistant D&I for Data and Partnership Interoperability, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about that as we're going forward. Ms. Wade has a wealth of executive leadership experience and a passion for solving digital, data, and organizational challenges to drive change. In her current role, and in partnership with other chief data officers, she's responsible for integrating efforts and collaborations across the directorates and mission centers to devise strategic and tactical options to increase the speed of data sharing for mission use, which is it's all about the data, and that's what's key, is getting it to the right leaders at the right time to be usable. So thank you for being with us, Ms. Wade.
Great, thank you. I think what we're going to do is just a quick intro, right? Lori Wade, as stated, I'm the Intelligence Community Chief Data Officer. I do have a passion for the data and the digital side of things, but I have a history of that takes me back before 9/11 of working in the intelligence community. So I've been working in the intelligence community in both a public and private capacity for over 20 years, and I've seen a lot of change. As you mentioned, the rate of change and some of the tipping points and pivots of how the intelligence community has worked together, or not worked together for that matter, and how we've been able to share our data throughout all those times. And if you think about it, in the pre-9/11 and post-9/11 time, the changes were more policy related and public, and so now when you started to introduce new technologies over the years, and you get to the point where the last several years where you've had 5G, the Internet of Things, and we start to look toward the future, where we start to look at the next evolution of the internet and immersive technology in the next decade, we've gotten to a point now where we've got to no longer just look at the fact that we have volumes and volumes of data. We need to do the foundational work, but we are at a point where we need to look at the partnerships of how we're going to move that forward together. And that's where I think my background, having worked not only at the ODNI in the past, I was at NCTC, so I worked the counterterrorism mission. I've worked at FBI, I've worked with DHS, I've worked at NRO. So I've worked at a lot of the different agencies, to include most recently, prior to coming to this role, just a little over 90 days ago, I was over at CIA, where I worked in 2 of the mission centers leading the digital innovation. And then I was the Deputy Chief Data Officer there. So I'm coming into this role having had the breadth and depth across the intelligence community. And then on the partnership side, having experience in the past that I'll bring to working with the federal, state, local, tribal, territorial, and private sector. So all of those factors are important. And I just want to point out that I think the panel is that we've assembled here today with Dr. Martel and Dr. Fletcher is a good one, because key to a lot of the intelligence community work is our partnership with our DoD colleagues, and especially around the topics of data and analytics. So I look forward to more of the conversation that we will have, and to the questions. So thank you, General Lawrence, for having me, and look forward to the discussion.
That's very interesting. You touched on 2 points that the Director Abize talked about this morning, is women leadership inside of the roles in counterterrorism and other intelligent positions. So we may get some questions on that later. It was very interesting to talk about it. Our next panelist is Dr. Kelly Fletcher. Dr. Fletcher is the Principal Deputy Chief Information Officer at the Department of Defense. And in this role, she supports the DoD CIO in serving as the primary advisor to the Secretary of Defense for information technology, cybersecurity, communications, spectrum, and especially one of our big challenges, position navigation and timing. Dr. Fletcher is a career member of the Senior Executive Service, and we're very honored that you could make the time to be with us today, ma'am. So thank you.
I'm so happy to be here, and I do just want to shout out to Lori and Craig. These are 2 of my favorite people, so I think this is going to be a really good panel. I do just want to talk a little bit, very briefly, about why it's an exciting time to be part of DoD CIO. And not that in the past it wasn't, but I think right now we're really at an inflection point. And that's for 2 reasons. The first one is we've moved out of the desert, right? We had a really tough adversary, but they weren't a very technically adept adversary, right? They weren't identifying vulnerabilities in our systems. They weren't taking advantage of those vulnerabilities. It was a different kind of fight. So today, when we look at the next fight, and as we prepare for the next fight, technology is incredibly critical to that. The first thing is we know that we have vulnerabilities. And we know that the adversary is looking for more vulnerabilities, and we know that the adversary can take advantage of these vulnerabilities. So we've got to shore up the technical debt that we have. We have decades of technical debt, and we have to resolve that immediately. The other thing, as we look to the next fight, is that we know that data is going to be a critical portion of that in a way that it hasn't been before. Getting folks the right information, the right data, and making that data available to them to make a decision. Using data to actually drive decisions is going to be critical as we move to the next fight. So within vulnerabilities, I just want to talk about a couple of things that we're doing at DoD CIO. And the way I look at our job is sort of through concentric circles. So the first thing is sort of, I would say, traditional IT and cybersecurity, right? Everyone understands this. You've got computers, you've got networks, I have devices, you have your own end user device. And the way we're getting after that is through zero trust. And really, zero trust reflects the way that we do business today. So 20 years ago, when my data was on my computer or my data was on a server under my desk, it made sense to have really strong perimeter defenses, right? To shore up, to make a very hard outer edge of the Department of Defense networks, and then to protect with big walls there. And once you're inside, to sort of allow freedom of movement. And we've been transitioning over years from that, but now we are really focused on transitioning to an approach where we have regional defense. We have defense throughout the network, and no one is trusted. So you can't move laterally. There isn't a big wall outside the network. If you get in, we assume the adversary will be in the network. And the trick is going to be finding them and removing them rapidly and preventing them from moving laterally in the network. And it's, honestly, it's a culture change, and it's a mind shift change, and it's a technology change. Something that Mr. Sherman, the DoD CIO, always says is that we can't buy zero trust with one tool. We can't just deploy one thing and say, like, oop, zero trust, great. Like, no, it's how we run the network, it's how we defend the network, and it's actually the suite of tools that we have and where we deploy them. So moving out to like the next concentric circle, I would say, is getting into weapon systems. And things like position, navigation, and timing. This is incredibly important. Tactical data links. This is where the DoD CIO, frankly, earns their money, right? This is how we're different from a corporate CIO. We're looking at how do we have resilient positioning, navigation, and timing? How do we use alternative sources of that? How do we make sure our tactical data links are secure and resilient? So weapon systems, it's not just the software in those weapon systems, but it's also the things that we use to put steel on target. And then the last thing with respect to cybersecurity vulnerabilities that I want to talk about is the defense industrial base. So the defense industrial base has a lot of DoD's most critical information. They're the producers of this data, and they have it on their networks. And it really behooves us to raise their cybersecurity posture. So something that we're working on within DoD is CMMC version 2.0, which I can't go too deep into because it's going into rulemaking. And what that means is that we're not allowed to talk too much about it, but there will be time for public comment. So sort of what I want folks to take away is I know there's a lot of feelings about CMMC. Our objective here is to raise the cybersecurity posture of the defense industrial base. There will be a time for public comment on the CMMC rule, and we want to hear from you all. Are we going about this in the right way? Is it too onerous? Is it not onerous enough? I've heard all of those comments, and we're really hopeful that folks will comment even more on the rule. And then I just want to touch very briefly on moving to support data-driven decision-making, both from a business perspective and then also from a warfighting perspective. So DoD CIO is so happy that we have a CDAO to partner with on this, and I defer to Craig to talk more about the CDAO role. But I see DoD CIO really as an enabler for all of the AI and ML and really, really exquisite and cool stuff that CDAO is working on. It's our job at DoD CIO to make sure that the right data gets to the right place, that we have transport that gets it there, that it's cyber secure, that it gets there and it's accurate. It's our job to enable the success of the CDAO in this domain. So we're really excited to partner with CDAO. With that, I think back to you.
Okay, that's great and that's exciting. How is it published for people, industry, and our partners to go out and where do they go to make? The first time I heard it was earlier this week. Where do they go to make public comment?
Yeah, so it is not out for comment yet.
Okay.
We are entering rulemaking, which means that what we have will be provided to OMB, and then they will actually issue it out for public comment. So it's not yet available for public comment, but it will be, I believe, in early next year.
Okay. All right, great. I love it. Thank you so much. Our final panelist is Dr. Craig Martell. Sir, thank you for being with us. He's out on the West Coast, and I know it's very early there, so we appreciate you joining us. Dr. Martell is the DoD Chief Digital and Artificial Intelligence Officer as our first CDAO. Dr. Martell brings a wealth of knowledge and experience in machine learning and artificial intelligence. He has led the development of LinkedIn's AI Academy, was the head of the machine learning science and engineering for LinkedIn, as well as the head of machine learning engineering for data standardization, spam, and natural language processing. He most recently led machine learning for Lyft as well. Dr. Martell, over to you.
Thank you so much. Let me echo what the rest of the panelists said. These are two of my strongest partners. We're not going to succeed if we are not tightly connected to the IC community. And Kelly and I are talk 10, 15 times a week, and our offices are trying to join it today. It's the only way for us to get this done. So we're not going to get this done except without a very strong the actual building of those, we really call them exquisite and cool. I think that was cool. Exquisite and cool stuff.
It was cool, yeah.
Yeah. Building that exquisite and cool stuff, we do need to do that. And we do need to do that if we're going to beat China in the long run. We're going to beat our adversaries in the long run. Absolutely. Our adversaries are pushing very hard on building this exquisite and cool stuff. And they're doing it in a world where they don't have the same political limitations that we have, obviously, et cetera. So we have a very large AI challenge ahead of us. But in order to do this, we have to get the data right. So my hat is multifaceted. I am sort of the chief AI officer, but I'm also the chief data officer of the department. And that's where, in the beginning at least, I think most of the energy has to happen. And so, and then on top of that hierarchy of needs, I'm actually hearing an echo, unfortunately, but so if I mess up, forgive me. On top of that hierarchy of needs, that bottom layer of metrics, of data, the next one is metrics. How do we evaluate how well we're doing, both in the boardroom and in the battlefield? And we've taken that as one of our most important remits, to be able to help the department do outcome-based measurement and not just effort-based measurements. You know, funding and contracts is a great measure, but funding and contracts that delivered particular value, that's a better measure. So, so at the bottom level of the hierarchy of needs is data. At the next level of the hierarchy of needs is metrics, but you can't build metrics unless you have the data in the way both of the panelists described. So the data has to be in the right place at the right time in order to evaluate how well you're doing. Once you have those metrics, you can do analytics. And then finally, once you have that infrastructure in place, I actually believe AI is simply going to flourish. We do have to support AI. We have to build the right tools to support AI. But if you look at the education of the technically talented folks coming out of school now, all of them understand AI. It's just a natural part of the way they're starting to think. And so I think our long-term solution isn't imposing top-down AI restrictions. I do think we have to impose top-down data decrees. That part I agree. But I don't think we need to impose top-down AI restrictions. We need to build a support structure that allows for heterogeneity, that allows for our best contractors to build AI, our best universities to build AI, the FFRDCs to build AI. It shouldn't be centralized. If we centralize it, we're losing what I think is the biggest strength of the American industrial academic base. And so I see our job there as building the structures for that. But to do that, we absolutely have to partner with IC and CIO and other folks. For example, IC data is going to help with battlefield decisions. How do we make that happen? How do we actually make AI model decisions at the tactical edge in a contested environment where we have very little access to the cloud? Like, these are really important questions that are necessary to drive the valuable AI that we need, that I can't do without partners such as these. And so we're working on our way forward now. I've been there for roughly 100 days. So I think I'm starting to get a good sense of what we need to tackle first, and it's going to be getting the data right. I think that's a good place to end.
Yes, Dr. Martel, I couldn't agree more about that. As the past Army CIO G6, the challenge of the data was always the central focus as we go forward. Dr. Fletcher, the first step in leading change is establishing a sense of urgency. And urgency and Department of Defense are normally not in the same sentence. So, and yet the threats against our nation are at an all-time high, whether it's from cyber crime to natural disasters to near-peer nations, not to mention the pandemic. What are you doing to create this sense of urgency to lead the changes you're making?
That's a great question. And I think actually that dovetails into why it's so exciting to be part of CIO right now. So my leadership, the secretary and then the deputy secretary, who I think will be here just after this panel, they are really passionate about shoring up these vulnerabilities in our systems. And what we found is, there's a laundry list of things to do in the department, and really leadership attention is the critical thing for getting something done. So we've had a lot of conversations about how do we, make sure that we have the right funding to get after these vulnerabilities? The way that we program in DoD, it takes years to get a specific line to do this specific activity. Well, what we're finding is a lot of the things that we need to do, they're in the sustainment funds that are available now. It's just a matter of choosing to prioritize getting after vulnerabilities rather than providing new capability, or getting after vulnerabilities rather than doing something else with these sustainment dollars. So it's really a question of priorities. And right now, the priority of the department is ensuring that we're modernizing. And because we're seeing leadership attention on this, because we're looking at it with data-driven metrics, we're seeing a lot of big progress.
Right, that's great, thank you. Ma'am, Ms. Wade, I see this question a lot, and when I think about how we are fighting the Ukraine conflict in public, what are we doing to work across the classifications to try to declassify our data strategy as you're working that with your peers?
Well, interestingly enough, here in the next month or so, we'll be rolling out our IC data strategy, which will be, the data strategy itself will be unclassified. And that's very important because, as I mentioned, just some of my background, having been in different parts and having the federal, state, local, tribal, territorial, and of course working with my DoD colleagues on looking at our data, right? And if we look from the way the strategy will focus us on that deliberative planning of the data from the point of collection all the way through to exploitation, but also to disposition. If we start with that in mind and we start to really be deliberative in our planning about the data and understand the data at its core from the point of collection, then we understand what the real classification of the data is, right? And if we make a plan for the data at the beginning, and the plan takes into account who needs the data, why was the data being collected to begin with, where does the data need to go ultimately, and if the goal is to unlock mission value and insight at speed and scale and securely, then if we can, as much of that decision point we can make at the beginning, then the data flow will go to where it needs to go, to the people it needs to go to at the right time in the right place. And I think it's also important to understand that, this is what we've been talking about, this race that we have that we're marching toward in this next decade, and where we've just seen in the last several years is a lot of the data that's collected and a lot of the mission and the adversaries that we're working against cross boundaries, right? It blurs some lines between missions, and so does the data. And so we need to look at that in mind, right? Like, what is the strategy to how we're going to get it to the partners that need to come together to work on that? And a lot of our partners, right? And I just was out in Anchorage, the domestic D&I rep program, their Pacific Northwest conference, and we were there with and we were there at AFRICOM. Not AFRICOM, oh my God, AlaskaCom. Yeah, AFRICOM's a different story. We're working that too, don't worry. There, it became very apparent, right? Where people work and where the data lives is not completely on the high side. So we have to have a strategy for looking at where and when and how we're going to use the data, and where our partners live and need to do the work. And so that's what the strategy will focus on, is how do we do that? And then also at the same time, how do we use AI and automation to help us with that, so that we can, some of that we can automate at ingest.
Right.
Right? And so again, it's all about how do we do that in a way that we can bring speed and scale and unlock mission value and insight to the greatest extent possible across multiple ints and multiple domains.
Right.
Can I actually, I love what you just said here, and I just wanted to foot stomp that this is a challenge that DoD is also facing. And sort of the best example that I've heard of it is someone said, like, you do this right, and I was like ready to get righteous about it and say, like, I don't do this. And it was like, if you're not sure what something is, you click no foreign. You know what I mean? Like, you're like, oh, I know it's secret. I'm not sure if it's, and then I just click no foreign, send the email, and like. And I think this is something that we have a perverse incentive structure a little bit. There's nothing bad happens to me for over-classifying something or making something harder to share. but it's harmful to how we engage with our allies. And so I think actually like partnering with the IC to get after this, and I love the idea of looking at the beginning. I think that's brilliant. But this is a problem that we at DoD have as well.
Right.
If I just follow up, the other part of the strategy that's going to help do that too is we have to, I'm trying to look for the, in fact, I'm holding up just the final draft of the strategy because I'm trying to really be intentional about the word I use here about raising a lot of people talk about raising the data acumen or data literacy of the workforce. And I think it's beyond that for me, and I'm trying to come up with the words where it's either going to be like transform, and have a data capable workforce at all levels and across all disciplines. Like we don't just need the data professionals, data scientists, data management professionals, data engineers doing this. I need everyone working, looking at data and how they use data and how when they get a visualization of data, they need to be able to ask data-driven decisions and questions about that data. And they need to understand just the scope and the complexity of how that data comes together. And we need that to happen. We need our lawyers, our acquisition folks, our privacy and civil liberties folks, working with my CIO and CISO colleagues, working with our AIM program. All of those people need to come together to figure out how as a collective we're going to, when we go end to end, and we have where those intersections are and how we solve for that to address these issues. But when the data finally makes it to the decision makers, they need to actually be able to rely on the data that they're looking at and knowing that they're getting the best of what's available, and that, along the way, analysts, targeters, everyone who's been touching and looking at that either have some competent level of data acumen, but in some cases, data tradecraft. So that is a big piece that will be in the strategy as well.
Yeah, I think that's even a larger risk is data veracity. Is it true? Can it be trusted? What's the source? And working those pieces. And we do have a question about disinformation we'll come back to, but I want to go back to Dr. Martell at this time. The question from industry is, past JAIC acquisition paths, IDIQ awards, seem to be slow to start or dormant. What are we doing to procure priorities for AI, ML? What's the timeline and path looking like for you?
Yeah, that's great. I don't actually have an answer for you yet, other than to say that you've nailed one of the key problems. Like, we're going to have to, if our goal is to embrace this heterogeneity from an AI perspective that I'm talking about, we need the appropriate infrastructure in the DoD, not just technically, like maybe the way to ship models from multiple sources, for example, or to monitor models from multiple sources, but we also need the right acquisition authorities, and we need to do that at speed. In addition, we need to be able to do them competitively. Like, in an ideal world for me, we could say, here's a problem, and here are n potential industrial competitors who can fight it out and see who produces the best results. So I think we have to move much more in an agile speed direction, and that's high on my list of things to tackle once the emergencies are over, but that'll be soon. So look forward to our actually giving some guidance on that in the next 6 to 9 months.
Okay, great. Now, I'll stay with you, Dr. Martell, but I'm going to go to our other panelists as well. I think this is critical. How does the community integrate more innovation technology to help with the workforce retention, given the ability to work from home, from the neighborhood, from SCIFs, and to be more mobile? I think workforce retention is key on everybody's mind. And not only that, in this world, is having enough workforce available to do all of the missions that we have across the intelligence, the DoD, and the cyber environments. Dr. Fletcher?
Yeah, this is a great question. And actually, this is something where the leadership is really focused on and said, when people come to DoD, if it takes them 2 weeks to get their email working, it's hard to recruit, sort of the best of the best, which I think actually I have the best workforce I could ask for. My hope is that I retain the excellent folks I have, and that I recruit folks who are very much like them, with obviously diversity, geographically, sort of in every way. I want a diverse workforce. But I just want to start this by saying, I do think some of these conversations start with, like, how do you even get anyone good? And, like, as a DoD employee, that's offensive, right? like I'm good, my employees are great. So I think we have a great workforce now, but how do we retain them and how do we recruit other excellent people? And this really gets to user experience, frankly. I think it's our job to make it so that even though you're operating at various different security levels, things work. You come in, you sign into your computer, and it consistently works. And so we're doing a lot of things to get after this. The first thing, frankly, is we have to know what's working and what's not working. So a lot of it is anecdotal, right? When I'm walking around the Pentagon, people will stop me and show me their phones and how their email isn't loading.
Guilty.
Yeah, that's right. Actually, yeah. I didn't even remember that. Craig and I, the first time we met, I was getting lunch, and Craig was mad about his email.
It's 100% true.
Yeah, this is a true story. So, but this is anecdotal, and it was appropriate for him to be mad about his email that time. But what I would say is these anecdotal stories are, it's good for me to hear, but what we really need is metrics, who's having real problems when, and we have who called the help desk, but frankly then we need the next layer down. And the next layer down is, what is the problem, right? Is the problem that your laptop is super old? Okay, let's fix that. Is the problem that the network is slow, and that's your local area network on your base or in your sort of region, or is the problem a big DoD network problem? And so what we're doing is really getting after the metrics that are going to help to answer that so that we can solve what the real problem is. And I want to give a shout out to the Air Force CIO, Awesomeberger, who did some really good work on this. And what she found is she can do all kinds of cool stuff with the transport in her network, because we all sort of assumed that was a big problem. And actually, the most effective thing she could do is buy folks new laptops. And that's true of her folks and the studies she did. I don't want to say that's universally true, but that's the kind of good work that we need to do, is to figure out what is the real problem and then address that. And we're very serious about doing that.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Ms. Awesomeberger, and I thought she handled the fix my computer with grace as it went viral, as we went through. Dr. Martell, you're standing up this new office, and having the right skill sets and workforce is critical to you. So what are you doing to recruit and retain the best qualified workforce?
Yeah, I have two sorts of answers. The first one is, I think we shouldn't be trying to go back to the pre-pandemic work life. Once we've discovered, I have an 11-year-old and a 5-year-old, and my wife is a professional, so once we've discovered work from home and the flexibility that allows, and taking care of our children and mixing work and family life, I have a hard time imagining going back to that. I personally think it's a mistake to force that all the way. Now, in DoD, of course, there are some things we have to do in person. There are some things we have to do not in person, but at different classification levels. So for my workforce, I'm encouraging folks to figure out, are there resources near them that would allow them to be in a SCIF when they need to be, and to talk to us via video conference when they need to be. So we don't have a strong view that says you have to be in the building, except when you have to be in the building, right? So my promise to them is, I will be in the building whenever I need to be, but I'll be with my family as much as I can be. And I want them to have that attitude as well. And then we're going to figure that out. I don't quite know that balance. I'm going to say I don't know a lot, by the way. So anybody listening, there's going to be a lot of I don't knows. I don't quite know the balance of that yet, but I think that's the right, that's the attitude that we've chosen. Be in the building whenever you have to be. Be with your family as much as you can, and we'll figure out what tools we need to do that. So that's one sort of workforce issue. The other sort of workforce issue, which I get asked a lot, is, well, what about people who are experts in AI? And I think the solution to technical recruiting is to not think about recruiting folks from hire to retire anymore. That's actually not the way we're going to get technical talent into the department. We're going to get technical talent in the department by tours of duty. Like people who want to come because they're mission driven, like myself. The mission really drives them. And they'll stay for 3 to 4 years. And then if we do our job right, we will make them more marketable after they leave. So if we can give them hard problems that they can sink their teeth into, that they can tackle and win on, then when they go back to industry, they'll even have greater skills. So, but potentially counterintuitively, I want to make it as I want people to be as talented, to grow as much as possible while working for us, so that industry will want them even more. Why? Because if industry wants them even more at the end, more people will want to come in and do those tours of duty. And I think that's the way we're going to compete, the only way we're going to compete with Silicon Valley. One other twist to that is, I think very strongly we have to do scholarship for service, which helps fund people in the appropriate STEM fields, and then we give them an amazing apprenticeship in the DoD. So our job for these sorts of, for tour of duties, is to make sure that tour of duty upskills them significantly, so it becomes a really attractive, on the input end, really attractive for folks to want to join that tour, to take that tour of duty, and on the output end, a great recruitment tool for industry. Industry is going to want to come there and see it as a recruitment pipeline. And then we're going to get those folks for the time in between. And this is my attitude, in particular because the average tenure of an engineer in Silicon Valley is 18 months. So they have learned how to manage large-scale projects, produce things like Google and Microsoft, with a workforce that moves every 18 months. So it's definitely doable. It just takes a different kind of managerial mindset.
Thank you, sir. Ms. White?
This is something I've spent a lot of time. I've worked a lot on trying to think through this with other seniors in the intelligence community. I've participated in several forums to look at this. And I'll just say, from an IC optic, the IC Chico, the human capital, they're really leaning into this and trying to look and see what are programs, what are the competencies of future intelligence community leaders and officers. They're trying to put programs in place, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But I'll just say, for me personally, I've had multiple discussions on these forums and led different kind of chats, even during COVID, with different workforce from around the intelligence community. And we have to realize, right now in the intelligence community, and I'm sure in all of your workforces, we have 5 generations working, right? And I say that because we've got to look at the whole picture, right? We can't just focus on, the Gen Zs coming in, but how do we integrate across, right? But I am focused on the fact that because of the millennial and Gen Z population, we really need to look at how we are organizing ourselves and planning for them, because they are all coming in, especially the Generation Z, as digital natives. So they bring with them a different way of approaching problem sets. Their digital and data acumen is high. So what are we doing to ready ourselves to be able to take it, not take advantage, but leverage and put that to work and activate that against these big mission problems? So my role in that is to make sure that I'm driving everything that I'm putting in my strategy to implementation, so that those things are in place for them when we do have them in. The other thing I'll say is, we have to be data-driven in this approach and pretty intentional in how we plan for how we're going to do that work. And I talked about one of the tools in my toolbox, and one of the levers I want to pull is we'll also be putting out a new intelligence community private sector partnership framework. This is critical because we have to have a mindset change and cultural shift and action for how not only we work together across the community, but how we work with our partners and how we view our private sector partners, right? It's not just vendors, right? These are, and I've said this in other forums, how do we co-innovate? How do we work these problems? And how we're gonna get people comfortable with that is being very intentional. And I go back to the data and understanding the data, right? What is the data and where does it live that is unclassified? What is the work and expertise that can be done unclassified? What can be done at the secret, and what can be done at the high? And then we plan for that. And when we have that discussion, then it's very easy. And during COVID, I was successful in getting data science and development work approved to be done on the unclass side, right? So these are things, again, it goes back to intention, planning, and trying to pull that together. The other program I'll go back to that is just rolled out about 2 months ago for the intelligence community is a program called the Public-Private Talent Exchange, PPTE. This is a program, and there's going to be 5 areas, and I see the other, hi Rachel, the AIM director, new to her position too. She's leading an area, I'm leading an area. It's going to be focused on what are exchanges of talent between the private sector and the intelligence community officers, where we can send intelligence community officers into the private sector and do work against mission areas at all levels, on class, secret, and top, and vice versa, bring in the private sector into the IC to work big, hard problems. So this is something that's rolling out. So we're trying to be, again, very intentional and plan for that and have a data-driven approach to how we're addressing the talent and expertise challenge that's facing all of us, quite frankly.
Right. Dr. Fletcher, you mentioned cybersecurity of weapon systems. What is DoD doing to bake in cybersecurity for weapon systems at the beginning of the acquisition process, making sure cybersecurity is a key requirement?
Yeah, this is a really good question. So I've been in DoD for 10 or 12 years, and I can say that there's, in the requirements, these like sort of phone book sized documents, cybersecurity is always listed, So we've been including it nominally, but the cybersecurity, frankly, hasn't been great consistently. So what we're doing today is we're partnering with ANS to get after this, and we're trying to make sure that there's zero trust principles for our weapon systems as well as our networks. The place where I think we're driving success is that with the current administration, there's a big support to enforcement. So frankly, I think the challenge we've had in the past is that we've had these requirements, but they just haven't been prioritized, right? We're not perfect on hitting all of the requirements. So I think cybersecurity requirements haven't been prioritized. And I think that's been true when systems are in operation. I think that's true when systems are being designed. And right now what we're doing is we're finding those systems that are being sustained that don't have appropriate cybersecurity controls, and we are using the authorities that we have to take them off the network, to make sure that they cannot operate until they do have these cybersecurity controls. So I think as we do this with existing systems, it's becoming clear that there's some new rules around cybersecurity. This is one of your top priorities, whether you're building a plane or an IT system. We are going to be enforcing cybersecurity standards.
Thank you. Dr. Martell, the last step in leading change is anchoring new approaches in the culture, and we all know culture is powerful. John Cotter talks about the starfish that takes months crawling out of the ocean to get to the beach, and if it doesn't anchor itself, it just takes one wave to wash him right back out where he was. So in your new role and standing up this office, how will you anchor your work to ensure success in moving forward and not falling back into old ways of doing business?
How to not be a starfish, or how to be a successful starfish?
That's right.
So this is a great question. I think this is the right question. Like at the end of my tour of duty, I will be happy if there's some sustainable change that has taken place. So how do you change culture from a technical perspective? So let's start with that, because my major goal is to make sure folks do things technically correct, and I think being able to do things technically correct will drive our being a data-driven organization. And so a very good a friend of mine now, but who used to work for me, Willie Williams, once said to me that tools are embodied culture. And I think this is 100% correct. I'm going to expand it a little bit to say tools and processes and metadata are embodied culture. We have to think very hard about how we want our tools to behave and how we want those tools to make demands of their users. Because if we build a structure correct that says, oh, you can't use this tool unless you do A, B, C, and D first, then A, B, C, and D become part of the cultural landscape. People now think, I've got to do these things before doing that. So the type of cultural change we have to start with is essentially behavioral change with respect to data, for me, with respect to data and AI. And you do that by making sure access to the data, access to the tools, access to the processes are filtered by very clear structures. And there'll be pain for the folks now they'll go, I don't want to do it that way. That's a new way to do it. We don't do it that way. We have to do it this other way. I want to go back to something Kelly said before. I can't do any of this without the strength of our current leadership, who is unbelievably supportive of this and is willing to pound the table whenever necessary to get people to pay attention to it. So with that, I take it as my remit to make sure that those structures are in place, tools, processes, and metadata are in place, so that the next folks who come in simply say, this is the way we do things, right? The new folks, we're gonna have to shoehorn them into the new process. The current folks, we're going to have to shoehorn into the new process, but the new folks will come in and say, oh, this is just the way we do things. And to make that actually work, though, those tools, processes, and culture have to bring enough value to create a virtuous cycle. So we have to build tools, processes, and culture, the output of which people go, oh, wow, that's great. Yes, we need that. I'm going to put up with the pain of these new tools, processes, and metadata in order to get that output. This has worked for me in industry a number of times. I think there are specific challenges with DoD, particularly the fact that it's a very distributed culture, and the cultures are very different across boundaries. But this is the approach we're taking. How do we put in place the right tools, the right processes, and the right metadata requirements, so that the outputs bring value and it produces sustainable change. Hopefully that made sense.
That's great, sir. I think you're right on target there. Ms. Wade, the intelligence community has taken a few knocks in the past for not collaborating across its agencies. The next step in leading change is creating the guiding coalition. You've been successful in doing this in the past, in driving inclusion change and delivering results with impact. As the Chief Data Officer, and it is all about the data for the intelligence community, how are you going to create this successful coalition?
Okay, that was an easy question for me then. So I mentioned at the beginning, right, my background, the fact that I made a specific point to say that I've been in the intelligence community before 9/11, after 9/11, because that was a tipping point. That's, where certainly a lot of that kind of narrative came from. And I've watched that progress over time. And I've been in leadership roles. I've been, part of teams that have had to respond to leadership on this. And what I think when I think about what you just asked, when I hear the term, building, creating coalition, I think too often in the past, we have depended and relied heavily on coalitions of the willing, and we can no longer use that approach because, again, the future we're racing toward, this hyper-connected, data-driven digital world that we're working in, this next evolution that we're going to see with the internet and immersive technology, all the challenges we face are more complex and interconnected than ever before. So as an IC and as a leadership member in the IC, we have to take a step back and we have to quickly gain a collective understanding of what this means and how we operate and how we collectively determine what we need to do to go forward. That'd be number one, right? Personally, as the IC CDO, I've talked about some of the levers that I have to be able to enable deliberate and intentional coalitions and collaboration across the IC and with our partners. I'm interested in what Dr. Martel just said, is that we have got to hardwire this in to how we work. It's got to become part of the cycle all the way through, from the start to finish, from collection till we get to that enabling actionable insight. So the strategy is one lever that I'll pull to do that, where we're going to set the strategic focus areas and one-year action plans, and be very deliberative about how we're going to, in this first year, if we roll this out in another month or so, how we're going to focus on end-to-end data management to enable and reduce the time of data flow from collection to actual insight. And everything has to happen in between there. Deliver interoperable capabilities and analytics at scale and speed. I'm going to ensure data is AI ready and consumable by both humans and machines. This is important, right? Because this is bringing people together and getting data to them quickly. Establish new approaches, like I just mentioned, for the IC, how the IC works together and with our partners, and then accelerate that digital and data acumen and tradecraft across the IC. All of that I'll use the IC Chief Data Officer Council, which is made up of the 18 elements to include our DoD partners. I chair that, so we're going to use that. We're turning that, making sure that we're going to drive governance, collaboration, action, decision, and measure this against those milestones that we lay out in those one-year action plans. Also, with the new IC private sector framework, working with our federal, state, local, tribal, territorial, and private sector partners, and how do we increase the integration and collaboration with my colleagues. I think it's very important that I work closely with the IC CIO, the IC CISO, our AIM program and director, to be able to bring that broad coalition together so that we can share priorities, allocate resources, even have a discussion about how resources should be allocated to build out that ecosystem, and look at where we have not been able to move the needle, and that's where we need to accelerate, and we may need to do trade-off decisions about how we're putting dollars and resources. We just went through the strategic investment effort, and I can tell you, next year, I hope it's more data-driven, just because we've raised the data acumen a little more of people, because when we look at the investments and we look at doing more collection on something, we don't think through then what is everything that goes with that, and where the investments and priorities need to be. And then what do we need we need a zero trust architecture is critical, right? We need access control. Those things have got to be implemented. And so I really want to do that deliberate, intentional look at what those actions are to drive us closer to that.
That is great. I need to get those words and get them out there. We may do an interview with you.
Okay.
That was
Great. Happy
perfect.
to.
And it's the same, I'm sure, with the DoD CIO and CDAO as we go forward. We have 6 minutes left, and team, we won't start with the lunch till 12:45, so we'll have plenty of time to get over there. And I don't know what to do with my quote. There it is. So 2 minutes each, and thank you, team. This has been a great panel, great discussion. I appreciate the frankness and the sharing that you've done as we've done this. We talked about data veracity. I worry about that. Disinformation is a major tool for our near-peer adversaries. How can we best position and project our data and other information to ensure we're gathering this and facing the substantial threat from our adversaries? Dr. Fletcher.
Okay, thanks. So it's like a quick round.
Yes, yes.
I'll be quick. So I would say that mainly what I focus on is the veracity. I love the word data veracity. I'm going to steal that. Data veracity of DoD data. And frankly, the way that we found to get after if the data is accurate is to look at it, right? Let's use it. And so we've actually been using data, instead of making PowerPoint charts that have graphs, we've started to use a system to actually have like a dashboard that, the graph changes as the data changes. And man, let me tell you, the first time you upload the data without having like a very smart person carefully curate it, you realize like, oh, this isn't good. It's incomprehensible. It's wrong. It's wrong. But the way that we get the data right is by looking at it, right? And holding people accountable to it. So then people say like, well, that data's wrong. Great. It's your job to fix it. So the first thing we're doing in DoD really to get after data veracity is using the data. And it's making a huge difference. And then more broadly, talking about misinformation, I just want to sort of highlight the partnership with the interagency. So I think throughout the federal government, there's a lot of really important and good work happening on getting after misinformation.
Yep, good. Ms. Wade.
I feel like it cuts deep when I think about this. No, because I mean, it's the challenge I'm trying to deal with every day, right? And that is, it comes back to getting people around just the value of the data, right? We spend a lot and invest a lot to get the data, right? And then to be able to get the data utilization and sharing of the data to the greatest extent possible is one thing, right? We have to, just like you're saying, we have to use the data. But then we need to actually get people across all levels to understand when they're using the data, how do we get our leaders and our workforce, I'm talking at every level and at every discipline, I'm not just picking on the leaders, but when they're looking at something and they go to something that, at one point in time, right, we've taken things that used to be, maybe a review of a program, and they're used to it being presented to them in 200 slides, right, 200 PowerPoint slides. Well, I don't know who can make sense of that, right? So then, right now, because we're still working on some of the foundational areas through some miracles, right, and some hard work by individuals, we get it into that dashboard, right, and people see it and they're like, I love it. Let's get it for everything, right? But then they look at it and they still are treating it like they're looking at PowerPoint slides. So they don't quite know yet, I think, the criticality of trusting the data, trusting when we can put AI and automation against the data. So it's a cultural shift that's as important to the data itself, that we need a workforce at all levels that understands that we have to get to a place where we can trust analytics that have been put onto the data, and when we see the data, that we start to be able to ask the hard questions. Instead of, where now it doesn't always get to that point where people still want to think they got to see like volumes, like they need to trust that it's been brought down to just what they need to be looking at for good reason. And I'm not saying we don't do that in all cases. Certainly there are lots of success that has come out of that. But I think it's going to be even more critical to navigate as we go forward. When you're talking about zettabytes of data and how we get, how we weed out disinformation and other things, and then how we also have to look at compliance with our data. And so compliance, privacy and civil liberties, all of these things are important to our data as well. So all of that has to be factored in to get us to the point where we can work the way we need to in the future.
Dr. Martell, we'll have you wrap up for us, sir.
Okay, I think I can be pretty quick here. Just three quick points. You can't tackle all those zettabytes of data. You have to find the 20% that brings the 80% value and start there. To do that, you have to actually assign data product managers, people whose job it is to treat those tables, those data tables, as a product with customers, and commit to owning that data, commit to quality of service about that data, commit to the veracity of that data, and commit to how quickly it's updated. If there needs to be backfills, what's the timeline for those backfills? You need ownership of that data. Now, ideally, you need ownership of all the data, but there's zettabytes. We're not going to handle it. We're not going to do that. That's wishful thinking. We're not going to boil the ocean. We find the key data tables across the department and all the components that need owners. We give them owners. Their job is to make sure that data is right. It's got to be very operational, down at the table level. It can't be in the Pentagon thinking about it, which is what my job is. We need to get people out to the components who actually own that data and make sure it's good, make sure it's high quality. From an AI perspective, it's really important that part of the T&E process, the testing and evaluation process, includes adversarial AI testing. So what is adversarial AI? To be an adversary of AI is to simply change the input to the system in a slight way so that the system makes the wrong judgment. So for example, your automated car is driving, it sees a stop sign, it stops. If you put the appropriate stickers on that stop sign, the car will no longer interpret it as a stop sign and it'll drive right through the intersection. Right? So it's really important to think about these adversarial situations in the T&E environment during testing and evaluation, T&E phase, so that when you ship it, you've, number one, already evaluated for that, but also have very clear model monitoring and feedback loops so that when you see that that's happening, the model can be updated quickly. It's going to happen. We'll never catch everything in the beginning, so you have to have model monitoring feedback loops that allow for quick adaptation to quickly adapt to adversarial situations. So there we go.
Thank you very much. Please join me in recognizing and thanking our distinguished panel members. Thank you so much. Absolutely.